I knew something was off when I saw their shadows move behind the curtains, flickering in the dim light of our bedroom. My pulse quickened as I approached the house, each step heavier than the last. I kicked open the door, the old wood splintering beneath my foot. The sound echoed through the house, and as I stormed down the hallway, I could hear them scramble, their frantic whispers mixing with the pounding of my heart. They didn't have time to react. I burst into the bedroom, the shotgun already raised, my finger itching on the trigger. He was standing there naked and terrified, frozen like a deer in headlights. My wife, tangled in the sheets, let out a gasp that was more of a whimper. I didn't hesitate. I fired once. The blast was deafening, and his scream even more so. The buckshot hit him in the buttocks, sending him flying off the bed and crashing into the dresser. Blood splattered across the room, staining the beige walls. He bounced away from her, clutching his wound, his eyes wild with pain and fear. I cracked the shotgun, the empty shell clattering to the floor, and reloaded with a smooth, practiced motion. My wife was sobbing now, her hands covering her face, but I wasn't done, not by a long shot. I aimed again and pulled the trigger. Her cry was pitiful, but it did nothing to cool the rage boiling inside me. The blast tore through her shoulder, throwing her back against the headboard. She screamed, a high-pitched wail that pierced the air, but it didn't bring me any satisfaction. Not yet. Her lover, despite the injury, somehow found the strength to lunge at me, probably driven by some desperate need to protect her. His move was pathetic. His fists flailed weakly, blood dripping from his wound, but he was no match for the cold fury that had taken over me. I shoved him back with the barrel of the shotgun, and he collapsed to the floor, trembling, his strength finally giving out. But my violent revenge was just beginning. I stood over them, the shotgun still in my hands, my breath coming out in ragged gasps. The room reeked of sweat, blood, and betrayal. I watched as her lover writhed on the floor, the agony twisting his face into a grimace, but I couldn't bring myself to feel pity. Not for him, not for her. My wife tried to crawl away, her hands slipping on the blood-soaked sheets. I could see the terror in her eyes, the way she glanced at me, as if she couldn't believe that I was capable of this. But what did she expect? A loving embrace? Forgiveness? After what she'd done? I kicked the bed, the metal frame screeching across the hardwood floor, stopping her escape. "Where do you think you were going?" I snarled, my voice low and dangerous. She whimpered, curling into herself, tears streaming down her face. "Please, Dante," she choked out. But her words were meaningless, just like the vows she had broken. I crouched down beside her, the shotgun resting on my knee. "You think I don't know what you've been up to?" I asked, my tone dripping with contempt. How many times did you sneak him into our bed? The bed I paid for." She sobbed louder, shaking her head as if that would change anything. But her silence was all the answer I needed. "You disgust me," I spat, standing up again, the weight of the gun heavy in my hands. I turned back to her lover, who was now trying to crawl toward the door, his blood leaving a dark trail behind him. "You don't get to leave," I said coldly, walking over and pressing the shotgun to the back of his head. He froze, his body trembling, but I hesitated. Killing him would be too easy, too quick. He needed to suffer, just like I was suffering. Instead, I reached down and grabbed a fistful of his hair, dragging him back to where my wife lay crumpled on the floor. "Look at her," I demanded, forcing his head up. "Look at what you've done. You ruined my life, and for what? A few nights of stolen pleasure?" His eyes darted between me and her, panic written all over his face. But he didn't say a word. Maybe he was too scared, or maybe he knew there was nothing he could say that would save him. Either way, it didn't matter. He was going to pay. But my wife, she wasn't getting off that easy either. I let go of his hair, letting him collapse to the floor beside her. The sight of them together, broken and bleeding, only fueled the fire inside me. This was supposed to be my life, my marriage. But she had thrown it all away. For him, for this worthless excuse of a man. My wife, still cradling her wounded shoulder, looked up at me with those tear-filled eyes. But I was past the point of caring. I wanted answers, and I wanted to make sure they both understood just how much they'd be destroyed. "Why?" I demanded, my voice cutting through the air like a knife. "Why did you do this? Wasn't I enough for you? Or was it just the thrill of sneaking around behind my back?" She tried to speak, her voice trembling with fear and pain. It wasn't like that," she stammered, but I didn't let her finish. I didn't want to hear excuses, didn't want to hear her pathetic attempts to justify her betrayal. "Dante, lie to me!" I shouted, slamming the butt of the shotgun into the floor. The sound echoed in the small room, making them both flinch. "You've been lying to me for God knows how long. How long did you think you could keep this up? Did you think I wouldn't find out?" She shook her head, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. But I wasn't interested in her crying anymore. I wanted the truth, no matter how ugly it was. I reached down and grabbed her by the chin, forcing her to look at me. "Tell me," I hissed, my grip tightening. "Tell me why you did it." She choked on her sobs, her words barely audible. I don't know, it just happened. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, I echoed, letting go of her and taking a step back. "You think sorry is going to fix this? You think I'll just forget about it because you're crying?" She didn't answer, just curled up tighter, as if she could somehow disappear. But there was no escape from this, from what she had done. And I wasn't done with them yet. Her lover groaned, trying to push himself up, but I kicked him in the ribs, sending him sprawling back to the floor. "Stay down," I ordered, my voice like ice. He coughed, spitting blood onto the floor, but didn't try to move again. I looked down at both of them, my mind racing. What was I supposed to do now? The thought of simply walking away, leaving them to bleed out, crossed my mind. But that wouldn't be enough. They needed to understand the full extent of their betrayal. And then, as if fate was playing some cruel joke, I heard the sound of a car pulling up in the driveway. My heart skipped a beat. Who could it be at this hour? The sudden arrival sent a jolt of adrenaline through me, and I quickly moved to the window, peeking through the curtains. The headlights illuminated the front yard, and then they went out. I couldn't see who it was, but I knew I didn't have much time. Whoever it was, they would find the door broken, the chaos ID unleashed. I couldn't let them interrupt before I finished what I started. The tension in the room thickened as the sound of footsteps approached the front door. My heart pounded in my chest, every beat echoing in my ears. I couldn't let anyone see what I'd done, what I was about to do. The door creaked open and I spun around, shotgun in hand, ready to face whoever dared to step into this nightmare. My wife gasped, her eyes widening as she heard the door open, but she didn't say a word. She knew better than to draw attention to herself now. "Hello? Anyone home?" a voice called out, hesitant and unsure. It was a man's voice, unfamiliar and cautious. I clenched the shotgun tighter, my mind racing. Who the hell was this? I didn't have much time to think. The footsteps grew louder, moving down the hallway. I could feel the tension rising with each step. The only thing that mattered now was protecting myself, making sure this intruder didn't ruin everything. As the footsteps neared the bedroom, I took a deep breath and pressed myself against the wall, out of sight. My wife's lover was still groaning on the floor, and my wife was shaking, her eyes darting between the door and me, as if she knew this was about to get worse. The door swung open, and a man stepped inside, his eyes immediately falling on the bloody scene in front of him. He was tall, maybe in his late 30s, with a clean-cut appearance that screamed professional. He froze, his face draining of color as he took in the sight of my wife and her lover, both bleeding and broken. "What the hell?" he whispered, his eyes wide with shock. I didn't give him a chance to react. Before he could even turn around, I stepped out of the shadows and shoved the barrel of the shotgun into his back. "Dante, move!" I growled, my voice low and menacing. He stiffened, his hands slowly rising in surrender. "Look, I don't know what's going on here, but shut up!" I snapped, pressing the gun harder against him. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" He swallowed hard, his voice trembling. I am just a neighbor." I heard a noise, thought something was wrong. I didn't mean to intrude. A neighbor. Of course, the one I never bothered to know, who probably heard the shotgun blast and decided to play hero. Just my luck. "Well, you picked the wrong night to be a good Samaritan." I said coldly. Now you're going to help me clean up this mess. He nodded frantically, his fear palpable. Okay, whatever you want, just please don't hurt me. I gestured toward my wife and her lover with the shotgun. Start with them. I want you to get them up. Make sure they don't bleed all over the place. He hesitated, glancing at them with a mixture of pity and terror. Are you sure? Do it! I barked, making him jump. The man quickly moved toward my wife, helping her sit up, his hands shaking as he tried to assess her wounds. She's hurt pretty bad. Maybe we should get her to a hospital. No hospitals, I said firmly. She'll get what she deserves. Now move. He nodded again, his face pale as he turned to the lover, who was still barely conscious. The sight of him struggling to lift the man's limp body would have been almost comical if it weren't tea for the situation. As the neighbor did as he was told, I kept the shotgun trained on him, my mind racing with possible outcomes. This wasn't tea how I planned it. I never imagined someone else would get involved, but now that they were, I had to think quickly. But no matter what, I couldn't let any of them walk away from this unscathed. The neighbor struggled to get my wife's lover upright, his hands slipping on the blood-slicked floor. My wife whimpered as he touched her, but she didn't resist. She was too far gone, too deep in shock or fear to do anything but comply. I watched them closely, my mind working overtime to figure out my next move. This wasn't how I envisioned things. I wanted to make them suffer, to pay for their betrayal in a way they'd never forget. But now, with this neighbor involved, things were spiraling out of control. Listen, the neighbor said, his voice shaking as he tried to reason with me. You don't have to do this. We can just walk away, forget this ever happened. No one has to know. Do you think I am an idiot? I snapped, the shotgun still aimed squarely at his chest. You think I can just walk away from this? After what they've done? He flinched, his eyes flicking to my wife, then back to me. I don't know what happened, but this isn't the answer. You'll ruin your life. Please, let's just end this before it gets any worse. Worse? How could it get worse? My entire life had already been shattered. I'd lost everything that mattered because of their selfishness. But still, something about his words gnawed at the edges of my anger, made me hesitate for just a moment. Get him up, I ordered, ignoring the doubts creeping into my mind. And get her on her feet, too. The neighbor nodded, struggling to lift the half-conscious lover and dragging him toward the bed. My wife, still clutching her bleeding shoulder, stumbled as she tried to stand. She looked so pathetic, so small, like a child caught in a lie, and for a split second, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Once they were both standing, I backed toward the door, keeping the shotgun trained on all three of them. We're going to the garage, I said. Move! What are you planning? The neighbor asked, his voice trembling as he guided my wife and her lover out of the bedroom. You'll find out soon enough, I muttered, my eyes never leaving them. We moved slowly down the hallway, the house eerily quiet except for the shuffling of feet and the occasional groan of pain from her lover. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how to end this, how to tie up all the loose ends without leaving anything behind. When we reached the garage, I flicked on the light, illuminating the concrete floor and the rows of tools hanging on the walls. I kept the gun trained on them as I gestured for the neighbor to stop. Tie him up, I ordered, tossing a length of rope from the workbench toward the neighbor. He caught it clumsily, his eyes wide with fear. Please, we don't have to do this. Tie him up, I barked, cutting him off. Or you are next. He swallowed hard, then knelt down and started binding the lover's wrists and ankles, his hands shaking as he worked. My wife stood silently, her eyes fixed on the floor as if she couldn't bear to look at me. Good. Let her feel the weight of her choices. Once her lover was secured, I gestured toward the wall. Now her. The neighbor hesitated, glancing between my wife and me, but he didn't argue. He knew better by now. He took another length of rope and bound her hands behind her back as gently as he could, which only fueled my anger further. When he was done, I stepped forward, my eyes boring into my wife's. This is what you wanted, right? I asked, my voice low and cold. You wanted to be with him? Well, now you'll get your wish. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her eyes were pleading, desperate, but I wasn't going to let her off that easily. I turned back to the neighbor. You over there, I said, pointing to the far corner of the garage. I need you out of the way. He backed up slowly, his hands raised, his face pale. "Please, just let us go." "Shut up," I growled, turning back to my wife and her lover. "Now both of you get in the car." They didn't move, just stared at me, as if they couldn't believe what was happening. But when I raised the shotgun again, they quickly obeyed, stumbling toward the car parked in the center of the garage. "Get in the trunk," I ordered, the weight of my decision pressing down on me. But I refused to back down now. They hesitated, but the sight of the shotgun left them with no choice. My wife's lover, still bleeding and weak, was the first to crawl into the trunk, followed by my wife, who looked back at me one last time, her eyes full of fear and regret. But it was too late for that. I slammed the trunk shut, locking them inside. The sound echoed through the garage, final and unforgiving. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but my hands were trembling, the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. The neighbor was standing in the corner, his eyes wide with horror. "What are you going to do with them?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I stared at him, my mind a whirlwind of emotions, rage, betrayal, guilt. But I couldn't answer him. I didn't even know what I was going to do next. All I knew was that whatever happened, there was no turning back now. The weight of what I'd done settled heavily on my shoulders as I stood there in the garage, staring at the car that now held my wife and her lover. The rage that had driven me this far was starting to cool, replaced by a cold, creeping realization. I'd crossed a line, one that I couldn't uncross, but I wasn't done, not yet. I turned to the neighbor who was still standing in the corner, his eyes wide with fear. He looked like he might faint at any moment, and part of me wanted to let him, to just leave him there and walk away. But I couldn't afford to leave any loose ends. "Get over here," I ordered, my voice rougher than I intended. He flinched but obeyed, shuffling forward, his hands still raised slightly in a gesture of surrender. What are you going to do?" he asked, his voice trembling. He glanced nervously at the car, then back at me, as if trying to gauge just how far I was willing to go. "Doesn't matter what I'm going to do," I said, my grip tightening on the shotgun. "What matters is what you are going to do." He blinked, clearly confused. "What do you mean?" "You're going to help me," I replied, stepping closer, the barrel of the shotgun lowering slightly. "You're going to make sure this doesn't come back on me, understand?" He nodded quickly, his eyes darting around the garage as if searching for a way out. But there was no escape for him. Not now. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "First, we're going to make sure they can call for help," I said, nodding toward the car. "Get some tape from that shelf, make sure it is strong enough to keep them quiet." He hesitated, then moved toward the shelf, his hands shaking as he grabbed a roll of heavy-duty duct tape. He handed it to me, avoiding my gaze. "You're going to tape their mouths shut," I said, my voice cold and detached. "Make sure it is tight." The neighbor looked at me, his face pale, but he didn't argue. He knew better. He walked to the back of the car, and I handed him the key to the trunk. As he unlocked it, I raised the shotgun again, ready to fire if either of them tried anything. The trunk lid creaked open, revealing my wife and her lover crammed together, their faces pale and streaked with tears. They didn't say a word, just stared at the neighbor, then at me, the terror in their eyes almost palpable. The neighbor swallowed hard, then tore off a strip of tape. He leaned down and pressed it over my wife's mouth, his hands trembling so much that the tape crumpled slightly. She let out a muffled sob, her eyes wide with fear, but she didn't resist. Next, he taped her lover's mouth shut, the man groaning in pain as the tape pressed against his injured face. The neighbor stepped back, his face twisted in disgust, or maybe guilt, I didn't care which. "Now tie them up," I ordered, tossing him another length of rope. "Make sure they can move." He nodded silently, then got to work, binding their arms and legs tightly. My wife winced as the rope dug into her already wounded shoulder, but she didn't make a sound. Her lover, on the other hand, squirmed and tried to pull away, but the neighbor quickly finished the job. When he was done, he stepped back, his face pale and his hands shaking uncontrollably. I could tell he was on the verge of breaking, but I didn't have time to coddle him. I had to finish this. I slammed the trunk shut again, locking them inside. The garage was silent, the only sound the ragged breathing of the neighbor and the blood pounding in my ears. "Now what?" he asked, his voice cracking as he looked at me with wide, pleading eyes. "Now," I said slowly, my mind racing, "you are going to drive. I'll tell you where to go." He looked like he might faint at the suggestion. "Drive? But do it," I snapped, cutting him off. "Or I swear, you'll be joining them." His face went white, and he nodded quickly, heading for the driver's side of the car. I moved to the passenger side, still gripping the shotgun, and got in beside him. He started the engine, his hands shaking so badly that it took him a couple of tries to get the key into the ignition. The car rumbled to life, and I directed him to back out of the garage. As we pulled out of the driveway, I felt a strange calm settle over me. This was it. The final act. Whatever happened next, there was no turning back. Where are we going?" the neighbor asked, his voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. "Just drive," I replied, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. "I'll tell you when we get there." We drove in silence for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. The city lights faded as we left the suburbs behind, the darkness of the night closing in around us. My mind was racing, trying to decide what the end of this road would look like. But one thing was clear: this night wasn't going to end well for any of us. We drove in tense silence, the road stretching out like a dark ribbon before us. The neighbor kept glancing at me, his fear palpable, but he didn't dare say anything. He knew this was a one-way trip, and the destination wasn't going to be pretty. The city was long behind us now, the lights fading into the distance as we plunged deeper into the countryside. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and the muffled whimpers from the trunk, barely audible over the noise. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, but the calm that had settled over me earlier hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown stronger, like a cold, unyielding resolve. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I spotted a narrow dirt road branching off from the highway. It was barely visible in the dark, just a faint line cutting through the trees. I pointed to it, my voice steady and cold. "Turn here." The neighbor obeyed without question, the tires crunching on the gravel as we veered off the main road. The trees closed in around us, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. The darkness was almost suffocating, but I knew where we were going. We continued down the dirt road, the car bouncing over the uneven terrain. The neighbor was gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I didn't bother reassuring him. There was nothing I could say that would ease his fear or mine. After a few more minutes, we reached a clearing. It was a desolate spot, surrounded by dense woods on all sides. The ground was uneven, littered with fallen branches and dead leaves, the perfect place for what I had planned. "Stop the car," I ordered, and the neighbor slammed on the brakes, the car jerking to a halt. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl. I turned to the neighbor who was staring straight ahead, his eyes wide with terror. "Get out," I said, my voice low but firm, "and open the trunk." He hesitated for a split second, but the look in my eyes must have convinced him not to argue. He fumbled with the door handle, then stumbled out of the car, his legs shaking as he walked to the back. I followed him, the shotgun still in my hands, ready for anything. When he opened the trunk, the weak light from the car's interior illuminated my wife and her lover, both of them bound and gagged, their eyes wide with fear. They were trembling, their faces pale and streaked with sweat and blood. My wife tried to speak through the tape, her eyes pleading with me, but I ignored her. "Get them out," I said, stepping back to give the neighbor room. He nodded shakily and reached in, dragging her lover out first. The man groaned in pain, his wounds making it difficult for him to move, but the neighbor managed to haul him onto the ground. Then he turned to my wife, helping her out of the trunk as gently as he could, but she winced in pain as her shoulder hit the side of the car. When they were both on the ground, I stepped forward, the cold metal of the shotgun pressing against my palm. "On your knees," I ordered, my voice devoid of emotion. The neighbor looked at me in horror. but he didn't dare disobey. He knelt down beside them, his hands still trembling. My wife and her lover followed suit, their eyes locked on mine, desperate and terrified. For a moment, I just stood there, looking down at the three of them. This was it. The moment I'd been building toward all night. The moment of reckoning. But as I stared at my wife, her face twisted in fear, I felt something shift inside me. The rage that had driven me this far was still there, but now it was mixed with something else, something darker, something colder. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "You betrayed me," I said quietly, my voice almost a whisper. "You both betrayed me, and now you're going to pay for it." My wife's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't move, didn't try to speak. She knew there was nothing she could say that would change what was about to happen. "Please," the neighbor whispered, his voice trembling. "You don't have to do this." I looked at him, my expression hardening. "I do." Then, without another word, I raised the shotgun and aimed it at my wife's lover. He stared at me, his eyes wide with terror, but he didn't make a sound. I squeezed the trigger. The blast echoed through the clearing, a deafening roar that seemed to shake the very ground beneath us. His body jerked violently, then crumpled to the ground, lifeless. Blood pooled beneath him, dark and glistening in the dim light. My wife let out a muffled scream, her body shaking with sobs, but I didn't look at her. I couldn't tee. Not yet. I turned to the neighbor who was staring at the dead man in horror, his face as white as a sheet. "Get rid of him," I said coldly, the words barely registering in my own mind. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with disbelief. "What?" "Get rid of him," I repeated, my voice like ice. "Bury him. Do whatever you have to do, but get him out of my sight." The neighbor nodded slowly, as if in a daze, then got to his feet and started dragging the body toward the edge of the clearing. I watched him go, my mind numb, the weight of what I'd just done pressing down on me like a heavy, suffocating blanket. But I wasn't done yet. I turned back to my wife, who was still sobbing, her tears soaking the tape on her mouth. She looked up at me, her eyes pleading, begging for mercy, but I wasn't sure I had any left to give. "You did this," I said, my voice shaking with emotion. "You destroyed everything we had." She shook her head, her eyes full of desperation, but I couldn't bring myself to care. I loved her once more than anything, but that love had been twisted, corrupted by the lies and betrayal that now lay between us. I raised the shotgun again, my hands trembling as I aimed it at her, but this time I hesitated. I wasn't sure if I could do it, if I could pull the trigger and end her life, and everything we'd ever been to each other. And in that moment of hesitation, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. The neighbor must have called the police, or maybe someone heard the gunshots. Either way, my time was running out. I lowered the shotgun, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I looked down at her, my mind racing. The sirens were getting closer now, almost deafening in the stillness of the night. This was it, the end of the road. The sirens grew louder, piercing through the stillness of the night, and panic began to claw at the edges of my mind. The flashing blue and red lights would soon cut through the darkness, and there would be no escape. I was cornered, trapped by my own actions and the relentless approach of the law. My wife looked up at me, her eyes wide with terror. But there was something else there now, something that looked like a faint glimmer of hope. Maybe she thought the police would save her, that they'd arrive just in time to stop me from doing the unthinkable. But I knew better. They wouldn't arrive in time to save her, not from what I'd already done. But maybe, just maybe, they'd arrive in time to save me from myself. I lowered the shotgun completely, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The rage that had driven me this far was ebbing away, leaving behind a hollow emptiness that I didn't know how to fill. My mind raced, trying to find a way out, but there was no way to undo what had been done. The sound of the neighbor dragging my wife's lover's body to the edge of the clearing snapped me out of my daze. He looked back at me, his face pale and streaked with sweat, his eyes wide with fear. "We need to go," he said, his voice trembling. "The police, they'll be here any second," I nodded, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. "Get back in the car," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. Now. The neighbor didn't need to be told twice. He quickly abandoned the body and hurried back to the car, his footsteps crunching on the gravel. I glanced at my wife one last time, her tear-streaked face etched with fear and regret, and felt a pang of something guilt, maybe, or remorse, but it was too late for that now. I followed the neighbor, slipping into the passenger seat as he fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly that he dropped them twice before managing to start the engine. The car roared to life and he slammed it into reverse, backing out of the clearing with a frantic urgency that matched the rising panic in my chest. As we sped back down the dirt road, the sirens grew louder, closer, their wailing cries echoing in my ears like the final toll of a death knell. I gripped the shotgun tightly, my knuckles white, trying to calm the storm of emotions raging inside me. Fear, anger, guilt, it all swirled together, leaving me numb and confused. We hit the main road, the tires screeching as the neighbor swerved onto the pavement. The flashing lights were visible now, just a few hundred yards behind us, growing brighter by the second. The neighbor was driving as fast as he could, but I knew it wouldn't be enough. The police were closing in, and there was no outrunning them. "I can't do this!" the neighbor gasped, his voice cracking under the pressure. "I can go to jail for this! I didn't do anything!" He glanced at me, his eyes wide with desperation, but I didn't have any answers for him. I couldn't tell him it would be okay, that we'd somehow get out of this, because I knew we wouldn't. We were trapped, caught in a web of our own making, and there was no escape. The flashing lights were almost on top of us now, illuminating the inside of the car with their harsh, unrelenting glare. The neighbor's breathing grew more erratic, panicked, as he tried to figure out what to do. But there was nothing left to do, no options, no choices. The end was here. And then, just as the police cars closed in, I made a decision. A decision that would change everything. "Stop the car," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos in my mind. The neighbor looked at me like I was crazy, his eyes wide with disbelief. "What? Are you insane? They'll stop the damn car," I shouted, slamming my hand on the dashboard. "Now!" The neighbor flinched but obeyed, slamming on the brakes and bringing the car to a screeching halt in the middle of the road. The police cars swarmed around us almost instantly, their lights flashing, their sirens blaring, as officers poured out, weapons drawn and ready. "Get out of the car!" one of them shouted, his voice booming over the chaos. "Hands in the air! Get out of the car now!" The neighbor looked at me, his face ashen, his hands trembling on the steering wheel. "What do we do?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't answer him. Instead, I opened the passenger door and stepped out, my hands raised above my head, the shotgun still clutched in one hand. The police officers immediately trained their weapons on me, shouting commands, their voices overlapping in a chaotic jumble. "Drop the weapon! Get on the ground! Hands where I can see them!" I slowly lowered the shotgun to the ground, letting it clatter onto the pavement. Then I knelt down, my hands still raised, and waited for the inevitable. They were on me in an instant, shouting orders as they cuffed my wrists and pushed me face first onto the asphalt. The rough surface scraped against my cheek, but I barely felt it. My mind was somewhere else, somewhere far away, where the consequences of my actions hadn't yet caught up with me. As they hauled me to my feet and shoved me into the back of a police car, I caught a glimpse of the neighbor, who was also being cuffed and led away. His eyes were wild with terror, but he didn't look at me, couldn't look at me. I couldn't blame him. The door slammed shut, trapping me in the back seat, and as the police car pulled away, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. There was no going back. My life was over, destroyed by my own hand, and there was nothing left but the consequences. I stared out the window as the countryside sped by, the flashing lights casting eerie shadows on the trees. The silence in the car was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the engine and the distant wail of the sirens. And as we drove into the night, I couldn't help but wonder how it had all come to this, how love and betrayal and rage had led me to this point, this moment of complete and utter ruin. But there were no answers in the darkness. Only the cold, unforgiving truth of what I had done. The ride to the station felt endless, though I knew it was only a matter of minutes, My mind raced through the events of the night, replaying every decision, every action, like a movie I couldn't stop watching. The flashing lights of the police cars reflected off the windows, casting everything in a harsh, unnatural glow. I felt numb, detached from reality, as if this was happening to someone else. When we finally arrived at the station, they pulled me out of the car and led me inside, their grip on my arms firm and unyielding. The noise of the station hit me like a wave, phones ringing, voices shouting, the clatter of footsteps on the tile floor, but it all felt distant, like I was hearing it through a thick fog. They took me to a small, windowless room and sat me down in a metal chair, my hands still cuffed behind my back. The door clicked shut behind me, and I was alone with my thoughts, the reality of what I'd done closing in on me from all sides. I tried to focus, to think about what would happen next, but my mind was a jumbled mess of fear, guilt, and regret. I couldn't escape the images that kept flashing through my head, my wife's tear-streaked face, the lifeless body of her lover, the terrified look in the neighbor's eyes. I'd done this. I destroyed everything. The door opened, and a detective walked in, his face stern and unreadable. He sat down across from me, a file in his hands, and for a moment we just stared at each other in silence. Then he opened the file and glanced down at the papers inside. "Your name is," he began, but I cut him off. "You already know who I am," I said, my voice flat. There was no point in pretending anymore. The detective raised an eyebrow, then closed the file and set it aside. "All right," he said slowly. "Why didn't you tell me what happened tonight?" I stared at him, the weight of everything pressing down on me like a physical force. "What happened?" I echoed, my voice hollow. "You already know what happened. You have the bodies, the witnesses. What more do you need?" He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "I want to hear it from you. Why did you do it?" I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. Because I had to," I muttered, the words barely audible. "She betrayed me. They both did. And I couldn't just let that go." "Betrayed you how?" the detective pressed. "Was it an affair? Did you catch them together?" "Yes," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I caught them in our bed, in the house I paid for, the life I built for us. She destroyed everything. They both did." The detective nodded slowly, as if piecing everything together. "And you decided to take matters into your own hands, is that it?" I looked back at him, my eyes burning with unshed tears. "What would you have done?" I asked, my voice breaking. "What would you have done if it was your wife?" He didn't answer, just watched me with that same unreadable expression. I could tell he was trying to keep his emotions in check, trying to stay professional, but I could see the flicker of something pity, maybe, or disgust beneath the surface. "You didn't have to kill them," he said quietly. "There were other options." "I know," I admitted, the tears finally spilling over. "I know that now, but in that moment I couldn't see any other way. The rage, it just took over." The detective sighed, leaning back in his chair. "It's too late for regrets now. You know that, don't you?" I nodded, my head hanging low. "I know. It's just I never thought it would end like this. I never thought I'd be capable of killing them." He finished for me. I swallowed hard, the reality of the word hitting me like a punch to the gut. "Yes," I whispered. "Killing them." The room fell into silence again, the weight of my confession hanging heavy in the air. The detective watched me for a long moment, then stood up, gathering the file in his hands. "I'll be back," he said, heading for the door. "We'll take your statement formally, and then you'll be processed." I didn't respond, didn't move as he left the room, the door clicking shut behind him. The emptiness inside me was overwhelming, like a void that was swallowing me whole. I knew what was coming: jail, trial, sentencing, but I couldn't bring myself to care anymore. I was already condemned, not just by the law, but by my own actions. I had destroyed everything I loved, everything I had worked for, and now all I had left was the cold, unforgiving consequences. As I sat there in that small, empty room, waiting for whatever came next, I realized that my violent revenge had only brought more pain, more suffering, more loss. I'd thought it would make me feel better, make the hurt go away, But it hadn't he. It had only made everything worse. In the end, there was no victory, no satisfaction. Just a deep, unending sorrow that I would carry with me for the rest